Okay, gang, I'm back. I apologize. My iPad got full and I got cut off here. We were talking about the similarities between the beginning of the Mexican-American and the Vietnam War. And the Mexican-American War has this provocation by President Polk, who's vowing manifest destiny, and he will be sending troops into Mexican land, which will bring the beginning of a shooting war with the Mexicans. And in Vietnam in 1964, the American USS Maddox and some other ships are in North Vietnamese territorial waters in support of South Vietnamese commandos, and we're going to be attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and Johnson's going to go to the Congress, and he's going to say that this is an unprovoked attack in international waters, and this escalation will lead to a heightening of the war. We're going to go from this advisor phase into full escalation between 64 and 68. There's going to be over 500,000 boots on the ground. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that is given to Johnson is permission to prosecute, not to prosecute the war, but to protect our forces and those of our allies, which is going to lead to a full-scale war between us and the Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. The War Powers Act in 1973, just before the end of the Nixon administration, is going to be a reassertion of congressional authority in war making, and the War Powers Act is going to declare that from now on, in 1973, which is just a year before the war ends, that the president has to tell the Congress within 48 hours of American soldiers being in combat, and there's only 60 days to fight, and then 30 days to pull our soldiers out. That is if Congress does not give permission. And this idea of a credibility gap is what the government is saying and what the American people are experiencing and seeing and finding out is not the same thing. The Pentagon Papers are these papers that are released by Daniel Ellsberg, who is an independent analyst hired by the Pentagon to assess the success of the war, and his conclusion is that the war is not being won and probably can't be won, and this is contrary to what the government is saying, and he releases these papers. There's an attempt by the White House to stop them from being published by the New York Times, and the courts do not stop the publication. And the credibility gap is seen at its height here in 1968 when the Tet Offensive breaks out. The countercultural issues during the war are basically you have the hippies, you have the young people who are protesting against civil rights, and this is going to be coupled with the protest against the Vietnam War itself, and there's other things, environmental issues, and just general protests against the values, the materialism of their parents, in these things. In 1964, the election of Johnson is going to be a victory over Barry Goldwater, a very arch-conservative Republican, and Barry Goldwater is going to be running against the popularity of the Great Society. At the time, there's great support for eradicating segregation, support for civil rights, support for protection of the environment, support for consumer protection laws, support for education. There's going to be this great confidence that we can win the war in Vietnam. This is before it escalates greatly. We can win the war on poverty. And the famous Daisy commercial is this commercial with this little girl who's picking apart a daisy, and in the background you see a mushroom cloud. And this is a reference to the promise that Goldwater will intensify the war, and the fear here is, of course, that he will use nuclear weapons and he'll escalate this into a third world war against either the Soviets, the Chinese, or both. The Tet Offensive in 1968, the significance of the Tet Offensive is while the American people are being told that the war is being won, the Tet Offensive on this New Year celebration of the South Vietnamese, a lot of their army is on leave, and 100 cities go up in flames. The American embassy in Saigon is taken over. The second largest city of Hue is captured by the Vietnamese regular army, and all of these battles are ultimately won by the United States Army. And on a technical sense, this is a defeat for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, but psychologically, this is a victory for the North Vietnamese in that the American people want out. And the 68 election that's coming down the pike is going to see Richard Nixon with his sort of secret peace plan, his plan of peace with honor, which is really going to become Vietnamization, and that's turning the war over to the Vietnamese people themselves to fight. The South Vietnamese will be equipped, they will be armed, as we begin to sort of a drawdown of our soldiers there. The 68 election is going to be be between Nixon, who is going to be the Republican candidate, and the Democrats in their primaries are going to divide. Johnson starts out running, and he's going to lose the primary in New Hampshire. This is the first primary that's held. He's not going to lose the primary. Let me restate that. He wins the primary 49% to 41% against this rookie senator from Minnesota named Eugene McCarthy, but a 49 to 41% victory is really no victory at all. There shouldn't even be a question that he's going to win this, and he decides he's not going to run. He goes on TV, he withdraws, and then the standard bearer for the Democratic Party is going to be Hubert Humphrey. And there's another Democrat who's running, and that is George Wallace, who's a Southerner. Remember him standing at the doorway of the University of Alabama saying segregation now and forever and blocking the entry of black students. Well, he's going to run a campaign that's veiled racial anger. He's going to talk about law and order. He's going to be an anti-welfare candidate. And he's going to run as an independent for the American Independent Party, getting almost 1 million votes in 1968. And this is going to divide the Democrats, throwing the election to Nixon. At the Democratic Convention, where they're hoping for, the Democrats are hoping for a show of solidarity and unity, there's going to be protests outside of the convention by protesters, the hippies, and they're going to be doing things like climbing up park statues and putting Viet Cong flags on them. And the police are going to be pounding these protesters silly, and on public TV, where the unity is supposedly happening, they're going to see this great divisiveness. And within the convention, there's going to be anti-war protesters chanting and singing and waving banners and holding signs. And the American people are going to look at this and say the Democrats have lost control of the war, they've lost control of the country, they can't even control their own convention. And Nixon will come into office with this plan of peace with honor and Vietnamization. Nixon is very famous for his diffusing some of the tension in the Cold War by a policy called détente. This is a program of peaceful coexistence with both the Chinese and the Soviets. With the Chinese, he becomes the first president to visit China, and the first really president to have anything to do with the Chinese since 1949. And this is a stunning diplomatic move. The Americans turn on their TV and they see, all sort of out of the blue, here's the president, and he's in Beijing and he's toasting Mao and Chou Enlai. And the Shanghai communique that comes out of this meeting is an agreement with the Chinese to increase trade and diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. There's a lot of small things which are very symbolic, and that's trade delegations and athletic teams and scientists and so forth going back and forth, and astronauts and cosmonauts meeting up in outer space between the Soyuz and Skylab, shaking hands and doing experiments together. But the big thing is SALT, and that's just Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which is going to be an anti-proliferation treaty, reducing the number of nuclear weapons made. One of Nixon's goals is to drive a wedge between these two large communist nations, and he's largely successful in doing so, and he's looking for support to bring a conclusion here to the war in Vietnam, which will end in 1973. The Geneva Accords, which are negotiated between Henry Kissinger and his counterpart, Le Duc Tho of North Vietnam, are going to see the release of American prisoners of war. American Army will leave the country. South Vietnam will still maintain its own independent government for the next 2 years. There's supposed to be an election 2 years after the Geneva Treaty. This doesn't happen. The North Vietnamese will successfully invade within the next 2 years and take over South Vietnam, while Ford is in office. But Americans at the time see that this promise of peace with honor, getting our troops back, ending the war on favorable terms as being successful in 1973. And Henry Kissinger will win the Nobel Peace Prize with Le Duc Tho, who refuses to show up. He will not, after the peace treaty, be on the same stage with Kissinger as really a protest that we were in the war in the first place at all. That being the case, the SALT treaty is also followed by an ABM treaty. That's anti-ballistic missile treaty. That's an anti-missile treaty, which is an agreement for us not to use missiles as a shield, that we will not have missiles that shoot down missiles. The idea here is we and the Soviets agree that we will not, we'll make ourselves vulnerable so that we will not be tempted to launch a first strike. 1970, before the war is over, Nixon will broaden the war even while he's doing a drawdown by invading a neutral country next door, Cambodia. And the reason is that Cambodia, being very weak, couldn't keep the Viet Cong out. And the Cong are running across the border, hiding out from American troops. And Nixon sends our GIs in to flush out what are called the sanctuaries. This leads to protests at Jackson State, Mississippi, 2 dead there in protests and 4 dying at Kent State University in Ohio, where the National Guard is shooting on the protesters, and the students that die are just some bystanders, not even protesters. But the country is seeing, again, this divisiveness, and all these groups are dodging the war. The college students and the National Guardsmen don't have to go to war if they're in either the Guard or in college. And this is one or more of the manifestations of division in the country. Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, I'm looking again at the review sheet on the table here in front of me. You should know after Malcolm X is assassinated in 1968, a lot of things happening in 68. The Tet Offensive, assassination of Robert Kennedy after winning the Democratic primary, another Democratic candidate who will win the largest state and be assassinated. You have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, and there'll be an explosion of violence in over 100 American cities. And Malcolm X will sort of take the stage here as sort of being a black leader. He's one of the disciples of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, a very radical anti-black organization. You'll have the Black Panthers in California, who are carrying guns around, following the police, doing open carry in the hallways of the Sacramento Capitol building. And these are the things that are going to be creating what's called the white backlash, where Nixon and on the other side, George Wallace, are both going to be getting some traction here with whites who are very frustrated with the hippies and the riots and with the failure of the war, and just they want change. One thing that you should keep in mind here, when we talk about George Wallace in 1968, not to be confused with Henry Wallace, who is a candidate for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in 1948, running against Truman, and Eugene McCarthy, who will win that New Hampshire primary as a peacenik in the Democratic Party, not to be confused with Joseph McCarthy, who's the anti-communist witch hunter in the 1950s. The elections of 1952 and 68 are similar in that 52 is in the middle of the Korean War. We elect a new president from a different party, that being Eisenhower, who promises to go to Korea and end the war, and the war ends when he's in office in 53. And in 1968, the war is going very badly under Johnson and the Democrats, and we elect Nixon, the Republican, to wrap this war up. 1973, while Nixon is president, there is a sneak attack on Israel. Israel sucker punched by the Syrians and by the Egyptians, who attack the Israelis on this Day of Atonement, Day of Prayer and Fasting, and we emergency airlift supplies and arms from our bases in Germany. The Soviets become very concerned as the Israelis start marching towards Damascus and Cairo, and we sort of call the Israelis to pull back here. And the outcome of the war, what is significance other than another Arab humiliation and Israeli win, is the Arabs get together, they form the Organization of Petroleum and Exporting Countries, that's OPEC, OPEC, and they're going to jack up the cost of petroleum from $3 to $12 a barrel, and overnight the cost of gasoline quadruples, and this is going to lead into huge inflation in the ensuing years through the rest of the Nixon years and then into Ford and into the Carter years. You should know the term stagflation. Stagflation is high inflation and unemployment at the same time. Theoretically, this is not supposed to happen. If you have Economics 101, you'll hear that high unemployment is supposed to bring prices down because people aren't spending money, and high spending or inflation is supposed to be creating jobs, so you're not supposed to have unemployment. But for various reasons here, you have stagflation, which is going to haunt these presidents after Richard Nixon. The 72 election, right before the Geneva Accords that will end the war, Nixon is reelected, and he's going to defeat his rival. The candidate for the Democrats is George McGovern, who's very much a peacenik, and he's calling for an end to the war on any terms. And what's ironic about this very decisive victory of Richard Nixon is that his administration will be involved in the bugging of the Democratic National Campaign Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. And this is the scandal that will bring down his presidency. And Nixon, the short of it is that Nixon most likely did not order the break-in here, but Nixon knew about the break-in and he ordered a cover-up. And this is called obstruction of justice. And the tapes that he had, his own tapes in the Oval Office, have him talking to his underlings about telling the FBI and the CIA not to investigate, and he's involved in the cover-up. And there will be a special Senate investigating committee, or a House investigating committee, that will vote to bring charges against him for impeachment, and the president will, of course, before it can be voted on the floor, he will resign, and the president will go. The presidency will be turned over to his VP, who is Henry Ford. As far as the environment goes, you should be aware in the 60s, early 70s, you have a lot of pro-environmental legislation being passed. The Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. You have under Nixon the establishment of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the AP will ask you the question that's called a synthesis question, where you're going forward or backward in time, looking for something that's very similar or something that's very different. And in particular, very similar is what would be your best strategy, and what they had on a question last year talking about the environment was the similarity to President Teddy Roosevelt, who during his term put aside national park land and national forest land in his love for the wilderness and concern to protect the environment. Finally, some Supreme Court rulings. The Warren Court is a very liberal Supreme Court under Earl Warren, who, again, ironically, he's the guy who worked with the military to put the Japanese Americans in prison camps in World War II. This may have been an act of penance, being more liberal, more concerned for civil rights when he made it to the Supreme Court after leaving California. Anyhow, in Griswold versus Connecticut, the Warren Court rules that there's a right to privacy, which can be read into the Constitution, and the Griswold case involves Massachusetts had a law that you could not sell contraceptives even to married couples. The Supreme Court says no, this law is unconstitutional based on this implicit right of privacy, and this becomes the basis later for Roe v. Wade, which the ruling is that there is a right to privacy, a right for a woman to have in her first trimester an abortion. The Gideon versus Wainwright case is the right to have a government-paid attorney, and Earl Clarence Gideon is a Floridian who will argue all the way to the Supreme Court that he should not have been given as severe a sentence as he had. He's guilty of breaking into a pool hall and stealing beer out of a cooler and some change out of a jukebox. And he will have a retrial, and he'll actually be let off with a lawyer to defend him. The Miranda decision, Miranda versus Arizona, is the decision that you have a right to remain silent until you have an attorney. You've probably seen this in TV shows and movies where the cop says to the person who's being arrested that you have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can be and will be used against you. And finally, the Engel versus Vitale ruling is a decision that there must be no prayer in public schools. So guys, I will see you on test day. If you see me before the test, ask me any questions you got. Be looking at your book. You should be underlining, and you should be highlighting, and you should be looking at your notes there, looking at the notes I've given you. Be looking at a review book. Look at this review sheet. Everything on it reflects a question that will be on the test. So signing out, good luck.